Hello, welcome to our first section of notes in Unit 9. We're going to talk a little bit today about the start of the Civil War. The title for today's notes is War Erupts. We've spent quite a bit of time in Unit 8 talking about some of the things leading up to the Civil War, the cause of the Civil War. Today we're actually going to talk about how the war begins. So we've talked a little bit about this date in Unit 8. We've kind of targeted April 12th, 1861 as the official start of the war. There would be some people that might argue that the actions of what's happening in Kansas and Missouri and the border war might actually be included in some people's eyes as the start of the war. But the first official military action between the Union and the Confederacy takes place in South Carolina at a harbor outside the city of Charleston, South Carolina, at a place called Fort Sumter. Now, about a week after South Carolina officially broke away from the Union forces that were in South Carolina retreated to an island in the harbor in Charleston, and they began to defend this island or fort in the harbor of Charleston. And so what happens is the Southern forces, after trying to kind of wait them out for a while, decide to officially start to bombard this fort. And since the people inside the fort are Union soldiers, and the people that are bombarding the fort are representing the South Carolina, which is now broken away, seceded from the Union, and joined the Confederacy, this is why the date of April 12th, 1861, is considered to be the start of the war. The South bombarded the fort for about 30 some hours. Here's a map. You can see where Fort Sumter is here in the harbor. And so the Southern troops began to bombard Fort Sumter. Again, it was about a 30-hour bombardment. There basically were no casualties. I believe that some reports say that there was one Confederate soldier that bled to death as a result of one of the cannons misfiring as they attacked the fort. And then there's also a report that one of the Union soldiers was killed when they were trying to give a 100 gun salute, and on the 47th firing of the cannon, it backfired and killed one of the Union soldiers, and then they decided to limit that to a 50 gun salute that was happening. So the battle itself at Fort Sumter, eventually the fort is surrendered. The Confederacy takes over the fort. It's not really that important as far as a strategy move or anything like that. But of course, it is important because it is the first official engagement of the Civil War. Now, Lincoln, after this, decides to call out more Union troops and begins to increase the size of the army, the Union Army, to be able to put down this uprising, because that's really what the Union is viewing this as. The Union views this as the South is in rebellion, and they need to win the war to be able to win back the South and have them be part of the Union again. Now, one of the states that has a really big decision to make is Virginia. And Virginia is important for several key reasons. Number one, they're a very large state physically. When you look at a map and you consider that West Virginia was part of Virginia at this time, Virginia is a very sizable state in square miles. They also have a large amount of wealth. They have a large population. And they also happen to be the home of a lot of the great military leaders at that time period. And Virginia decides to join the Confederate States of America. And this is a really important move because of all those reasons, but especially because it's the home of one specific general, Robert E. Lee. Now, Robert E. Lee was at one point asked by Lincoln to be the commander in charge of the Union Army. And some reports say that Lee actually probably would have taken up President Lincoln on his offer. But Robert E. Lee was extremely loyal to his home state. And when Virginia decided to side with the Confederacy, Robert E. Lee then refused Lincoln's offer to be in charge of the Union Army. Robert E. Lee was considered to be the best military general at this time period. He had a lot of experience. He was the top of his class when he graduated from the military academy. He had experience in the Mexican-American War. So this is a big blow to the Union because now the South is going to have the best general possible, And even beyond Lee, when you look at most of the leadership that the Confederacy has, they have much better military leaders. And as we go through the war, we're going to see that Lincoln struggles with finding a really good leader to be in charge of the Union Army. In many cases, the Union Army has many advantages that the South does not have, but they don't have a really good leader. So Robert E. Lee becomes the general in charge of Confederate troops during the Civil War. Now, we've talked a little bit about the border states, and you guys have been given a map that shows those. The border states are kind of unique. They're states that are officially part of the Union, but they are located right on the border between the Confederacy and the Union. And then many of these states also have slaves. And so kind of a unique situation that they're part of the Union, and yet they also allow slavery within their borders. Missouri, our home state, is one of those states. We're a border state. And as we talk about what happens with Missouri during the war, again, we'll kind of talk about this several times. You know, Missouri is very conflicted. Here in Clay County, where we live, a lot of people supported the South. And even though we were officially occupied by a Union Army and Union forces, a lot of people did side with the Confederacy. Let's take a little bit of time to look at this map. There's a lot of different things represented on this map. Let's start off by looking at the free states. Obviously, we're going to see these teal states up here are the states that are what we consider to be free. The states that are purple, these are slave states that remain loyal to the Union. Again, West Virginia breaks away from Virginia as a result of the Civil War beginning. And then you'll also notice that there is a number on some of these states, and that number is a percentage of white families that own slaves. Now, again, this is a percentage. So here in Missouri, as a state in total, just about 13% of families owned slaves. Now, when you come down to Mississippi, for example, that number increases to almost half of the population. So 49% of families in Mississippi owned slaves at that point. You'll also see that there's some different colors here as far as the Confederacy. The red states are the slave states that seceded before the outbreak of the war, so before the official action that takes place at Fort Sumter. And then the ones that are orange here, these are the slave states that secede after the outbreak of the war. So once the action at Fort Sumter happens, then they decide to officially join the Confederacy. So, and then these other ones like the territories and stuff, those are officially to be considered to be Union-held territories, but they're not officially states. So, for example, on that map that you guys are working on, we have Oregon and California. Those are different than the territories because they are officially states at this point, and they're part of the Union. This map shows largely the same thing. You can kind of see the difference between the dark blue states, the states that seceded before the fall of Fort Sumter, and then what happens afterwards, the gray states that join after Fort Sumter. Kentucky is also a key state as one of the border states because it contains so many key rivers that are used for transportation during the war. You can kind of see some of these rivers. These are just the major ones. But again, you almost have to think of rivers as almost like interstate systems today. That's the fastest way to get large amounts of goods and even soldiers. They do put soldiers sometimes on boats and things like that. Steamboats are becoming more and more popular at this time period. So if you can have access and control a river, it's almost like controlling an entire interstate system. It'd be like trying to make sure that if there was a war in the Midwest, if you could control I-70 and I-29 and things like that to be able to transport things. We've looked at some of these numbers a little bit already in the last unit, but again, to kind of go over them again here. Population, about 71% of the total population is going to be in the Union. And as far as manufacturing plants, another huge advantage for the Union, 85% of manufacturing plants are going to be in the Union. Total railroad miles, again, big advantage as far as being able to transport large items. 71% of railroad miles are located in the Union. And then industrial workers, 92%. So again, this is not slaves. This is people that are able to work in the factories. About 92% of the factory workers reside in the North. Now, as far as the advantages that both sides have, President Lincoln would definitely be considered an advantage that the Union has. He is a great leader. This is one of the big advantages that the Union has, is his ability to make decisions. And as we study what Lincoln does throughout the war, he does do some very courageous things, and is able to, support the Union in a very difficult situation. Anytime you have a civil war, that's almost one of like the toughest situations that a government could go through, because part of your own country is fighting you essentially as much as they can. I mean, they've broken away, they've formed their own country. That's probably one of the worst situations that any country can have as far as trying to fight some type of war. The Union also has huge advantages over the South in terms of people, resources. We just saw those graphs a little bit ago. The Union has a huge advantage in factories, railroad miles, and also the Navy shipyards. So kind of, again, similar to what we mentioned with the Revolutionary War, it's hard to just kind of create a Navy. It's a little bit easier, although difficult, but it's a little bit easier to kind of organize an army. But building ships and, getting all that kind of stuff with the Navy organized, that's going to take a little bit more time. Now, we are going to see some very interesting things happen later on as we talk about the Navy. They're going to come up with some very interesting innovations, submarines and ironclads and all kinds of stuff. So we'll talk about the Navy a little bit more, but at this point, at the start of the war, the Union has a big advantage as far as naval power, and they're going to use that as part of one of their strategies that we're going to talk about. So one of the things that the Union wants to do is to destroy the South's economy so that they're going to be forced to end the war. From all the things we've talked about, we know that the South is going to be somewhat limited on the different ways that they can bring in income. Their main thing is exporting cotton. So the Union's going to try and destroy the South's ability to export cotton. And because the South doesn't have a lot of manufacturing located within their own states, they're going to have to bring in material goods from someplace else. They're obviously not going to get those from the Union. They're going to try and bring those in from other countries. And so the Union wants to somehow stop the trade that's happening both in and out of the Confederate States. And one of the ways they're going to do this is called the Anaconda Plan. So the Anaconda Plan is named after the large snake, the anaconda. And if you know anything about the anaconda, basically the anaconda is going to squeeze its prey, and it's going to kill it by constricting it. Okay? So the Union plan is to shut off all Southern trade and then, in essence, ruin their economy. And they're going to do this by trying to shut off all their trade coming in and out of the Confederacy that's coming by sea. So the Anaconda Plan is really doing exactly what it means here. It is trying to shut off all the ports in the South. This is a political cartoon from 1861 called Scots Great Snake. That's the name after one of the people that came up with the Anaconda Plan. But you can definitely see from this political cartoon, the basic essence is shut down all the ports and prevent anything from getting in or out of the South. So officially what the Union does is called a blockade. A blockade is when armed forces prevent the transportation of goods or people into or out of an area. So since they have a huge advantage as far as naval power, they're going to try and use this to their advantage by shutting things down and not allowing stuff to get in or out of southern ports. Now, this is going to be kind of a tough thing to do because obviously you've got a lot of miles of ports here. I believe there's something like 3,500 miles of coastline that the Union's going to have to try and shut down. And they do a fairly effective job. This is a map that shows kind of some of the patrol areas. You can kind of see different types of areas control different parts. So it does shut down a lot of the major trade that the South has. But when you look at statistics, the South was able to run what they called blockade runners, which would be typically smaller ships that were kind of a little bit faster and were a little bit harder for the Union to be able to spot and catch and stuff. About 5 out of 6 Confederate runners were able to get through the blockade. Now, if you listen to that stat, you might say, well, gosh, how could you consider the blockade to be successful? But what you have to remember is a lot of the larger ships basically just decided not to go in and out of ports because they figured they would get caught. So some of the runners were successful, but a lot of times they were smaller ships. Now it's interesting to note that the Union forces, it was a very beneficial thing to be one of these squadrons that was watching the coastline, because if you captured a ship, the contents of the ship, the Confederate runner, the contents of that ship were then auctioned off, and all the crew members of that Union ship were able to divvy it up. So if you captured a ship that had a lot of stuff on it, and in some cases, some of these ships had like tens of thousands of dollars worth of stuff, even hundreds of thousands of dollars in some cases, just by confiscating one ship, there were crew members that got paid almost the equivalent of like what 30 people might earn in an entire lifetime. So it was very beneficial, and a lot of people wanted to be on the United Naval Forces, the Union Naval Forces that were watching the different blockades. Now, one of the other strategies the Union wants to do is they want to capture the Confederate capital city of Richmond, Virginia. Now, the Confederacy did something pretty interesting here. They decided to put their capital in Richmond, Virginia, which was only about 100 miles away from Washington, D.C. So in many ways, this was kind of like a sign of defiance that they weren't going to be scared or they weren't going to be intimidated by the Union. They could have put the Confederate capital in, for example, Charleston, South Carolina, or Atlanta, Georgia, or some of the other major cities, but instead they put it in Richmond. Now, in the Civil War era, if you were able to capture somebody's capital city, you could cause quite a bit of havoc for that country, because there weren't things like the internet and phones and all the electronic communication and stuff. So if you got into their capital city, they in many cases then had to relocate their entire government. And this was a big deal. So that's one of the things that the Union wants to do, is capture Richmond. Now, we've talked a lot about all these advantages that the Union has, but it's also important to note that the Confederacy has some major advantages as well. We've talked a little bit about how the Confederacy has some of the best generals, not only General Lee, but some of the generals that are under him. The big one that's an advantage for the Confederacy is that the Confederacy only has to fight a defensive war. Now, what that means is that the South has seceded from the Union. They don't have to do anything. The Union has to make the South surrender and then bring the South back into the Union. So the analogy that I use sometimes is it's kind of like if you're playing soccer. There's a big difference if there's 10 minutes left in the game and you're tied or you're down by one, okay? If you're down by one, you've got to take some risks and you have to, do something to be able to create scoring that goal. If you don't need to score and time is your friend, then you can do some things to kind of delay and just kind of move around. A good example of this, again, goes back to the Revolutionary War. Remember Washington's strategy? He didn't have to do anything. He didn't have to attack and win major battles for the most part during the war. He just had to keep his army alive and keep things kind of moving on through time. And eventually, this would wear down the British. And that's really what the South is trying to do. They're trying to fight a defensive war in many cases. They don't have to force the Union to do anything. Another one that's sometimes brought up, and this can be an advantage or a disadvantage, is that because they're fighting a defensive war, a lot of the war is going to be fought on southern soil. Now, this could be an advantage because you say that you're defending your homes, you're defending your families, you're fighting on your own land. But if most of the war is fought on your own soil, that could also, of course, be a disadvantage because a lot of the damage through the war and the casualties, all that kind of stuff, is going to be on your soil as well. So kind of a plus, kind of a minus there. We've mentioned a little bit with that last slide, the South wants the war to last as long as possible. Every day that the war continues to go on, this is going to be an advantage to the South because they want to force the Union into eventually giving up. If the casualties get too high and the cost of lives, the financial losses, everything starts to build, eventually popular opinion in the North is going to be that they should just end the war. Eventually you get to a point where you begin to think about whether or not this is worth it. And again, I'm not trying to draw like a ton of analogies back to the Revolutionary War, but think about what happened with the Revolutionary War. Eventually, once we got into the later stages of the Revolutionary War, this is really what the people of England thought as well. They're thinking, why are we fighting this? We've lost so many people. It's getting very expensive. Let's just cut our losses and end this war. We've talked a lot about cotton in the last couple units. Cotton, of course, becomes the major economic product of the South. It's the basis of their economy. And they're also going to try and use this tool to gain some type of ally to help them fight the war against the North. The negative part of this is they've put all their eggs in one basket, and cotton is going to be the thing that they have to be able to sell to be able to continue to have money brought into the South. And so they're going to use this in some ways as a bargaining chip with the countries in Europe that they're trying to get as allies. So just like the American colonies in the Revolution were trying to get an ally to help them out financially because they really didn't have any type of income, the Confederacy tries to force England and France to help with the war effort by saying, hey, if you guys don't help us out, we're not going to be able to ship you cotton. And you need cotton to be able to run your textile mills. The plan does not work. There is no official aid or alliance between England and the Confederacy, although some historians have shown that it was something that England was considering. And so it's kind of one of those what if games that historians like to play. But, you know, what if the South had won a couple key major battles at certain points in the war? Would have England decided to jump into the war, officially help the Confederacy as an ally? Would have that been enough to overcome the Union? You know, in some cases, people say yes, it very well could have been enough to stop or enough to kind of put the South over the top and be able to allow them to win the war. So kind of one of those interesting things, but that never actually happens in the war. Now, we talked about Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter was a battle that took place in the harbor at Charleston. There weren't really any official casualties. It's largely just a bombardment and stuff. The first major land battle of the Civil War is called the First Battle of Bull Run. And this takes place very close to Washington, D.C. It's the first major battle of the war. And this battle is interesting because the Union decides to move down and kind of put some pressure on Richmond, Virginia. A lot of people in the North are clamoring that by July of 1861, again, remember that the first shots were fired in April, so now we're into July of 1861. A lot of people are saying, hey, we need to, you know, put some pressure on the Confederacy, go down, see if we can capture their capital city of Richmond. And so as they begin to move south from Washington, D.C., this is where the first major clash happens of the armies. And this first battle, people are kind of naive about what's going to happen. It's very close to Washington, D.C. There's quite a few people that come out from Washington, D.C. in carriages. They bring picnics. They kind of watch the battle from kind of on the top of the hillside overlooking some of the battle areas and stuff. And a lot of the people in the North assume that there's going to be one major battle, the Union's going to win, the Confederacy is going to decide they can't actually survive in this war, they're going to give up, and this is basically going to be the entire war. Some people believe that, okay? What happens in the battle in actuality is the Union makes a charge, the Confederacy makes a countercharge, and a lot of the Union soldiers decide to retreat back to Washington, D.C. In fact, some call it the Great Skedaddle. So the Confederacy is able to win this battle, and there's significant casualties on both sides. When I say casualties, I'm talking about people that are wounded, missing, or killed. But on both sides, there's about 5,000 casualties. Now, at this point, in July of 1861, this is the largest battle that's ever taken place with the most casualties in American history. So there's not a lot of history there, but looking back to the American Revolution, looking back to the War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, this is the single bloodiest day of American history, and this is going to be just a fraction of what's going to happen in some of the battles that are going to follow. So this is kind of a sobering moment for a lot of people in the North and the South, because after this, they realize that this is probably not going to be, you know, a 2-week war. This thing's going to be a major conflict. And Abraham Lincoln, after this battle, a couple days later, calls up another 500,000 troops to be enlisted in the Union Army. Now, one significant thing that happens in this first battle is the emergence of a major general for the South General Stonewall Jackson. There's one point in the battle where he's maintaining his men against a Union charge, and somebody looks up and says, "Hey, look at General Jackson. He's holding that position like a stone wall." And that becomes kind of his namesake, and he becomes known as Stonewall Jackson for the rest of the war, and along with General Robert E. Lee, becomes a major military figure for the South, and very, very smart in the field as far as military strategies and tactics for the Confederacy. So the Confederacy wins the first Battle of Bull Run. And by the way, we call it the first Battle of Bull Run because this same location has another battle later that is referred to as the, of course, second Battle of Bull Run. So technically this is the first Battle of Bull Run. But this stuns the Union. They kind of realize that, oh my gosh, this isn't going to be a quick war. And the South isn't, overjoyed by this. I mean, they're happy that they won this particular battle. But both sides, after this battle, realize this is going to be much longer and much bloodier than they ever would have thought of before. So that's just the very, very first part of the war. Talked a little bit about strategy, a little bit about Fort Sumter, a little bit about the first Battle of Bull Run, and we'll continue on this journey with the second section of notes next time. All right, well, thanks for listening, and we'll come back and we'll pick up the Civil War with our second section of notes later. Thanks. Bye.